Okay, we're now going to be hitting the middle part of our reading on All Quiet on the Western Front, and I want to give you some more background information on what was happening in World War II and what actually was the Western Front, the Eastern Front, and what this entailed for the soldiers fighting to give you a better understanding of what's happening to Paul in the book we're reading. First off, the Western Front, as you'll see on this slide, is going to occur on the western side of Germany. So think of your compass north, south, east, west. So Western Front is going to be your western side of Germany, going along Italy, coming up here through France. On Belgium's on the other side, which, as you remember earlier, Germany invaded as part of the Schlieffen Plan to attack France. So that is actually your Western Front. And on the Western Front, the force buildup was so bad due to the trench warfare that it was considered a stalemate, which means it's a deadlock. Neither side is able to defeat the other. Neither is gaining much ground. In the course of a year, they might only gain a few feet in either direction. And so there really was no winner happening on the Western Front. It was just slaughter after slaughter after slaughter on both sides of the fight. So trench warfare is going to become what they call a war of attrition, which means it just is wearing down the enemy at all times. All you're doing is losing soldiers. Morale is decaying, and you'll notice that in the book that Paul just keeps thinking worse and worse and worse thoughts. He comes from being more positive in the outlook at the beginning to getting more and more negative throughout, and that's an effect of this trench warfare, just wearing down the enemy. And so here we have a picture of the trenches here. Sorry about that background. We've got a picture here of what the trenches would look like. And so here is what we had that was called no man's land. So you'd have a line of trenches on one side, a line of trenches on the other side, and no man's land in the middle. And no man's land is this area between the trenches where it's understood that no man can survive due to being shelled from artillery, gunfire from the other troops. There were bombs hidden in the ground that they would explode. There was also lines of barbed wire fencing and posts, and so it made basically this obstacle course that nobody could get across on either side. And so you've got this barbed wire directly in front of the trenches, and this here is your frontline trenches. These were providing some protection from enemy fire, but artillery fire they were not protected from. So you remember artillery fire is going to come up on an arch and come down. The real protection from artillery fire would happen here on the second line of trenches. It would be a much deeper dugout that if they knew artillery fire was coming, they would come in here. And the Germans actually dug some of these so deep, some of them were 15 meters below ground, and so they were completely unaffected by artillery fire. But on the second line, you see this concrete bunker here, and this is where the machine guns would be located. But the secondary one's called the support. The third one all the way back is your reserve trench, so that if you are going to advance, you can notice the troops can move in between each of these trenches. So your reserve trench was here all the way in the back. Generally, these were where your commanders were going to be. Communication tunnels were dug underneath. You can see this little one here so that you could get in between them. And then all the way at the back, you had your long-range artillery. And so this could be firing if the enemy did decide to try to advance over no man's land. This artillery back here could fire all the way out into this area. Now, aircraft, for the most part, wasn't used in battle as we think of in World War II, where they're fighting. Although you did have aces who shot down other planes, aircraft at this time was mainly used for observation to know where troops and movement on these other troops were going. So the Western Front, it basically began the industrialization of war with all these new weapons that were modernized, could be manufactured very rapidly with interchanging parts. And one of the biggest was the tank. Because of these it didn't have wheels. It had these type of skids here that it could just continually go over any surface, and it was wide enough it could directly cross over top of the trenches that were dug and not be affected by the machine gun fire. One of the biggest advances in weaponry was the poison gas. It was first invented by the Germans, and while poison gas didn't necessarily cause immediate death, troops did die because of the inhalation, and the gas would be fired into the trenches where it would sink to the bottom of the trench. It's heavier, so it would go underneath the surface of the breathable air, and so the troops who were in the trench would then try to get out, and as they would get out, they would be fired upon. So you've got this poison gas that would cause death from inhalation at times, but some of it would also cause blisters and blindness, and so you had other illnesses and things happening to troops at that point. Like I said, the aircraft, while machine guns could be mounted on the front, your propeller would have to be lowered so you didn't shoot your own propeller, or off the back, you'd have a gunner off the back shooting as well. It was more for spying behind enemy lines to find out where your troops were going, where they were moving to, and how you could oppose them. Germans are going to start submarines now. They're going to perfect them during World War II, and they're going to dominate in the Atlantic because of them at that point in time. So you've got these German U-boats who are going to control the seas and attack not only military vessels, but vessels of other nations who are considered at peace with Germany, if they suspected that they were carrying troops or supplies to another country, as what's going to happen with the Lusitania. The Germans are going to sink that, and that's basically what's going to propel the Americans into World War I. And then you've got the machine gun. Now, this is brand new. The latest they had before this were rifles that had the tunnels, the rifle tunnels, which means that the bullet could be shot and it's going to be spinning and rotating, which means it's going to be going a lot straighter rather than just bouncing back and forth on the inside of the barrel. So you've got this machine gun, though, that's going to do 100 rounds a minute, and it will just plow down troops that are coming at you. So the Western Front, you've got battles of Verdun. It's going to be the French versus the Germans in this one, and this battle is going to last 11 months, and you're going to have 305,000 people dead and zero gains. No gains whatsoever. This is the definition of stalemate. You're going to have the Battle of Somme, which is the English and French versus the German. And here we have 1 million dead, and all the English and French gained was 5 miles of land. Next, you have the Eastern Front, and this is going to be our side against Russia. And Russia is going to suffer major, major losses. However, Russia has a much larger population than Germany could ever imagine. And so it didn't affect them as much, these large losses of people. Russia hadn't industrialized itself, which means Russia was mainly a farming area. It was very agricultural based. And so they didn't have guns and ammunition, clothes, boots, blankets, things that you would normally need to engage another army. And so here you've got our Eastern Front, and this is coming along the lines between German and Poland and Austria-Hungary, some through Romania. So that's going to be your Eastern Front. Now, World War I was what was called a total war. No one was safe. If you were a civilian, it didn't matter. All people and resources were devoted to the war effort. You had this idea of conscription. We know it more as the draft, where people were forced into the military. You had censorship of the press going on. And this is not just on the German side. This is also going to happen in England and France and America as well. Propaganda is going to be used, posters encouraging people to join the war effort and support their nation in defeating the Germans, spreading ideas. All this is going to go on. And then you have the entrance of women into factories so that the men can go to battle. So women are going to go into the factories to produce the munitions and things that are needed. Some of the women are going to go into a women's corps where they'll be working behind the scenes. Women will not be on the front line. And then here you can eventually see how everyone is going to enter into this war. So if you look here, these neutral states are the lightest ones, and you see it's very few and far between where they are. Most of them are either going to align with the Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, or they're going to align with the Allies. And if you notice, vast majority of these are going to lie with the Allies. Finally, in the middle of all this, you have the Russian Revolution happening into World War I, and we'll see that momentarily. While Germany's troops are going to be split between the Eastern and Western Front, after the Russian Revolution and Vladimir Lenin takes power, he's going to pull all of the Russians out of the war, which means Germany can now focus their war efforts on that Western Front where Paul is throughout the book. And so Russia pulls out of the war, and we've got 1 million German troops now moving from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, and they can focus their efforts right there. And then the U.S. is going to enter the war, as I talked about with the sinking of the Lusitania. The German U-boat's going to sink it, and we have 128 Americans dead. And this is going to cause America the final push to have the U.S. enter the war. This along with what's called the Zimmerman telegram. And this was a telegram sent from the German ambassador to the president of Mexico saying that if Mexico joins the war effort with the Germans, Germany will then come and help Mexico retake Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which were all considered part of Mexico before the Mexican-American War. And these two effects are going to have Wilson declare war on April 2nd, 1917. And this is where we're going to stop, and we'll finish with the war's end on session 3.